History often presents us with tales of conflict, where armies clash and nations rise and fall. Yet there exists a chapter of the 20th century so profoundly grim that it defies conventional understanding. Between the years 1933 and 1945, a vast expanse of Eastern Europe became the epicenter of a horror unparalleled in human history. In this region, stretching from Poland to the western reaches of Russia, and from the Baltic states down to the fertile plains of Ukraine and Belarus, over 14 million civilians were systematically exterminated. These were not soldiers lost in the heat of battle, nor were they accidental casualties of war. They were mothers, fathers, children, farmers, intellectuals, and workers who were deliberately targeted for death by state-sponsored policies of annihilation. It was a period defined not by combat, but by calculated, cold-blooded murder on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. This immense killing field, a geographical space defined by its suffering, was later given a name that encapsulates its tragic legacy: the Bloodlands. Coined by the historian Timothy Snyder, the term identifies the specific territory where the murderous ambitions of two of history's most brutal totalitarian regimes, Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, converged and overlapped. The people living within these borders found themselves caught in a devastating pincer movement of terror. They were subjected to wave after wave of violence, first from one tyrant and then the other, often becoming victims of both. The Bloodlands were not merely a backdrop for war, they were the very stage upon which Hitler and Stalin enacted their most nightmarish visions for humanity, turning fertile soils into mass graves and vibrant communities into landscapes of silence and sorrow. The story of the Bloodlands is therefore not a traditional military history. It is the story of the defenseless, the innocent, and the forgotten. It is an account of how political ideology, when fused with absolute power, can lead to the methodical destruction of entire populations. The narrative shifts our focus away from the celebrated generals and grand strategies that dominate many historical accounts. Instead, it demands that we look into the faces of the victims and bear witness to their fate. We must explore the policies of mass starvation, the networks of execution sites, the grim logistics of deportation, and the relentless purges that defined life and death in this tormented part of the world. This is their story, a solemn chronicle of suffering that must be told, remembered, and understood. To truly grasp the significance of what transpired, we must venture into a dark corridor of the past, one that many have found too painful or too complex to confront. We must set aside simplified narratives of good versus evil, and instead examine a reality where two monstrous systems competed in their capacity for cruelty, often learning from and enabling one another. The shadows of Hitler and Stalin met in these lands, and the darkness they cast was absolute. This introduction serves as a gateway to that world, a prelude to understanding not just what happened in the Bloodlands, but why it happened, and why its echoes continue to resonate with profound importance in our world today, on this day of May 24, 2024. When we think of the immense death toll of the mid-20th century, our minds often gravitate toward the iconic battlefields of World War II, the beaches of Normandy, the frozen city of Stalingrad, or the skies over Britain. These were places of heroic struggle and immense sacrifice where the fate of the world was decided by force of arms. However, the concept of the Bloodlands forces us to look beyond these front lines and confront a different, more chilling form of violence. The 14 million who perished here were overwhelmingly non-combatants. Their deaths were not the unfortunate collateral damage of military operations, but the intended outcome of state policy. This was a new kind of warfare, one waged not against armies, but against entire civilian populations, with the goal of reshaping society through mass murder. The terror inflicted upon the Bloodlands was multifaceted and relentlessly systematic. It took the form of engineered famines, where food was weaponized to starve millions into submission, as seen during the Holodomor in Soviet Ukraine. It manifested as political purges, like Stalin's Great Terror, where hundreds of thousands were arrested on fabricated charges and executed with a bullet to the back of the head. It appeared as ethnic cleansing and genocide, most horrifically in the Holocaust by bullets, where Jewish communities were rounded up and shot in forests and ravines. Deportation trains carried countless families to the desolate gulags of Siberia, a journey from which many would never return. These methods were the tools of governance for both Hitler and Stalin, turning the region into a ghastly laboratory for their totalitarian experiments. The central idea of the Bloodlands is that these lands were unique because they suffered the full, combined force of both Nazi and Soviet terror. A Pole in Warsaw, for example, could be arrested by the Soviet NKVD in 1939, survive a gulag only to be murdered by the German SS in 1943. A Ukrainian villager might endure the man-made famine of 1933, be targeted during the purges of 1937, and then find their home becoming a killing site during the Nazi invasion of 1941. The regimes were not just neighbors in brutality, their actions were often intertwined. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, a non-aggression treaty between Hitler and Stalin, was in reality a joint plan to dismember Poland, directly initiating the cycle of dual occupation and shared violence that would define the Bloodlands. Therefore, to understand this history is to move beyond a simple narrative that pits one evil against another. It requires us to see how these two regimes, while ideological foes, often pursued similar goals with terrifyingly similar methods within the same geographical space. They both sought to eliminate national, political, and ethnic groups that stood in the way of their utopian and ultimately dystopian visions. This essay will delve into this dark convergence, setting the scene for the specific atrocities committed first by Stalin, then by Hitler, and then by Stalin again. It is a journey into the heart of a darkness created by the meeting of two of the most destructive forces in modern times, an essential history for comprehending the true cost of totalitarianism. The term Bloodlands does not refer to a single nation or a recognized political entity, but rather to a specific and tragic geography of suffering. It encompasses the territories that today constitute Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, along with the westernmost fringes of Russia. These are the lands that had the profound misfortune of being caught directly between the expanding empires of Nazi Germany to the west and the Soviet Union to the east. It is crucial to understand that this definition is not based on traditional borders, but on the overlapping zones of mass political murder. The Bloodlands are defined by where the killing happened, mapping out a region not by its mountains or rivers, but by its mass graves, execution pits, and landscapes of man-made famine. This was the epicenter of state-sponsored violence in the 20th century. The designation of this region is a deliberate act to shift our historical perspective. Instead of viewing the crimes of the Nazis and the Soviets in isolation, confining the Holocaust to Germany and the Gulag to Russia, the Bloodlands concept forces us to see where these horrors physically converged. This was not just a battleground where armies passed through, it was a space where both regimes implemented their most radical and destructive policies aimed at civilians. The people living here were not just Poles, Ukrainians, or Jews, they were inhabitants of a unique zone of death where the normal rules of civilization were suspended not once but twice. Their homes became the primary sites for the implementation of both Hitler's and Stalin's plans to remake the world according to their brutal ideological blueprints. The experience of living within the Bloodlands was one of perpetual peril, where danger could come from either side. For the inhabitants of eastern Poland, for example, the terror began in 1939 with the Soviet invasion, followed by deportations and executions. Less than 2 years later, these same people would face the Nazi invasion and the horrors of the Holocaust and German occupation. The perpetrators changed, but the reality of living under a murderous regime remained constant. This dual victimhood is a defining feature of the Bloodlands. The region's geography made it a target for both powers, each viewing its people and its territory as obstacles to be removed or resources to be exploited in their quest for absolute control and ideological purity. Therefore, when we speak of the Bloodlands, we are speaking of a place where history's deadliest ideologies became a territorial reality. It is a concept that moves beyond national histories to tell a transnational story of shared suffering. It emphasizes that for millions the experience was not simply of one tyranny, but of a sequence of tyrannies that compounded the devastation. Understanding this geographical definition is the first step toward comprehending the scale and the nature of the atrocities. It was not an abstract conflict happening far away. It was a tangible, localized slaughter, where the soil of one's own homeland became soaked with the blood of one's neighbors, friends, and family, a grim legacy that defines this region to this day, May 24, 2024. The question of why this specific region became the Bloodlands is central to understanding the tragedies that unfolded. It was not a matter of chance. These lands became the crucible where the utopian and genocidal ambitions of both Hitler and Stalin were forged. For Hitler, this territory was the designated Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. His vision, outlined in Mein Kampf, involved conquering Eastern Europe, eliminating its native Slavic and Jewish populations and resettling the land with German colonists. The people who lived there were seen as Untermenschen, or subhumans, who could be enslaved, expelled, or exterminated without moral consideration. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Operation Barbarossa, was the first step in making this depraved vision a reality, turning Ukraine and Belarus into vast killing fields. For Stalin, this same region represented a different kind of ideological battleground. These were borderlands that needed to be secured, controlled, and forcibly reshaped into a compliant part of the Soviet Empire. The territories contained large populations of Poles, Ukrainians, and others with strong national identities that were seen as a threat to Soviet unity. Furthermore, Ukraine, with its fertile agricultural lands, was central to Stalin's plan for rapid industrialization. His policies, such as the forced collectivization of agriculture, were designed to break the will of the peasantry and extract resources for the state, regardless of the human cost. This led directly to the Holodomor, the terror famine of 1932 to 1933, an act of mass murder intended to crush Ukrainian national aspirations and secure Soviet control. The convergence of these two destructive ideologies created a perfect storm of violence. Both regimes were fundamentally revolutionary. They sought not just to govern, but to transform society completely, and both saw mass murder as a legitimate tool for achieving their goals. The lands caught between them were not merely a buffer zone, but the primary objective for both. They contained the resources Hitler coveted, and the enemies Stalin sought to eliminate. The presence of a large Jewish population in this region also made it the epicenter of the Holocaust. For the Nazis, the conquest of the Bloodlands was inseparable from their plan to annihilate European Jewry, and the majority of Holocaust victims were murdered here, often in public shootings rather than in distant camps. Ultimately, the Bloodlands became a laboratory of terror because both Hitler and Stalin saw the region as essential to their future, and its existing people as disposable. It was a place where state power was absolute and the value of human life was reduced to zero. The lack of strong, independent states capable of resisting either Germany or the Soviet Union left the populations utterly exposed. They were trapped between two systems that, while ideologically opposed in their ultimate aims, one based on race, the other on class, were functionally similar in their methods of terror. The result was a spiral of violence and counter-violence that consumed millions, turning a vast and vibrant part of Europe into the deadliest place on earth. Before Hitler's armies arrived, the Bloodlands were already soaked in tragedy. Stalin's terror had begun. Stalin's forced collectivization in the early 1930s targeted Ukraine's independent farmers, aiming to crush resistance and fund Soviet industrialization. The state imposed impossible grain quotas, then confiscated all food, leaving villages to starve. Borders were sealed and news of the famine was suppressed. The world remained largely unaware. The Holodomor, death by hunger, was a deliberate act to break Ukrainian identity and independence. Millions perished in one of the world's most fertile regions, their bodies lining roads and empty homes. Survivors described eating grass and bark, and a silence fell as entire villages vanished. This was not a failed policy but a calculated genocide by decree. The Holodomor set a precedent. A modern state could murder millions through bureaucracy, not bullets. Before Auschwitz, Stalin had already turned Ukraine into a graveyard, foreshadowing the horrors to come. As Ukraine mourned, Stalin unleashed the Great Terror, state violence on a new scale. From 1937 to 1938, the NKVD hunted not just party rivals, but entire ethnic groups in the Western USSR. The Polish operation alone saw over 111,000 executed, accused of espionage or sabotage for mere ties to Poland. Other minorities, Germans, Latvians, Estonians, Finns, were targeted in similar purges. The terror swept through the Communist Party, devouring loyal officials and commanders. Guilt was assigned by category, not evidence. A name, a rumor, or ethnicity could mean death. In total, about 700,000 were executed, atomizing society and destroying trust. Stalin personally approved execution lists, making mass murder a matter of paperwork. The Great Terror left the Bloodlands traumatized and vulnerable, just as a new threat loomed from the West. The region learned survival depended on the whims of distant dictators. Stalin's terror was not chaos, it was policy, executed with chilling bureaucracy. The Holodomor and Great Terror were tools for social engineering, targeting entire groups as enemies. Quotas, decrees, and paperwork turned murder into routine administration. Stalin's ideology justified the destruction of millions as a step toward utopia. Victims became statistics, stripped of identity and humanity. These methods, execution lists, deportations, camps, became a blueprint for future atrocities. Mass killing was institutionalized, not hidden, but carried out by thousands, just following orders. Stalin's campaigns were intentional, reshaping the Bloodlands and setting a precedent for political mass murder. The stage was set for even greater horrors as Hitler's armies approached. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa began shattering the Hitler-Stalin pact and unleashing hell on the Bloodlands. 3 million German troops invaded, aiming not just to conquer, but to annihilate. The region became the central killing ground for Nazi ambitions, Lebensraum, and the destruction of Judeo-Bolshevism. The Soviet army, weakened by purges, collapsed under the assault. Einsatzgruppen followed, tasked with murdering Jews, communists, and other enemies. Nazi violence was public mass shootings in forests and villages. Entire communities erased. Slavs were deemed subhuman. Millions of POWs and civilians were starved or killed. The German occupation was merciless, designed to clear the land for colonization through terror and murder. The Bloodlands became a slaughterhouse where Stalin's and Hitler's policies converged in ultimate brutality. Survival became a daily struggle against two of history's most destructive regimes. The Holocaust began not in gas chambers but in the fields and forests of the Bloodlands, a holocaust by bullets. Einsatzgruppen and local collaborators rounded up Jews, marched them to ravines and shot them face to face. Babi Yar, near Kyiv, saw nearly 34,000 Jews murdered in 2 days, one of thousands of such massacres. Victims were deceived, stripped, and executed in public, often before their neighbors' eyes. The killers were not distant. They looked their victims in the eye, pulling the trigger themselves. Entire Jewish communities vanished in hours, their history erased, homes looted. This intimate violence was psychologically taxing, but deemed necessary for Nazi goals. Local populations witnessed or participated, leaving a legacy of complicity and rare acts of rescue. Over 1.5 million Jews were murdered by bullets before the death camps began their work. The Bloodlands became a vast, unmarked cemetery, genocide woven into daily life. The unparalleled violence unleashed by the Nazis in the Bloodlands was driven by a coherent and deeply radical ideology centered on the concept of Lebensraum. For Hitler, the war in the East was not merely about defeating the Soviet Union, it was a biological struggle for racial supremacy. He believed the German Aryan race was destined to expand and that the fertile lands of Poland, Ukraine, and Western Russia were its rightful inheritance. The Slavic peoples who inhabited these lands were deemed racially inferior, a primitive barrier to German expansion that had to be brutally swept aside. This worldview transformed the conflict from a military campaign into a genocidal war, where the laws of humanity no longer applied and mass murder became a strategic objective. This ideology was meticulously planned and articulated in documents like the General Plan Ost or Master Plan for the East. This chilling blueprint outlined the long-term vision for the conquered territories of the Bloodlands. It called for the extermination, expulsion, or enslavement of tens of millions of Slavs to make way for German settlers. The plan was to be implemented over several decades, beginning with the systematic starvation of the urban populations and the elimination of the local intellectual and political elites. The Nazi invasion was therefore just the first step in a vast project of demographic engineering, a plan to violently remake the ethnic map of Eastern Europe in accordance with the tenets of racial biology. The war against the Soviet Union was thus framed as a war of annihilation, or Vernichtungskrieg. German soldiers were indoctrinated to see their Soviet opponents not as fellow soldiers, but as Judeo-Bolshevik subhumans who deserved no mercy. This dehumanization explains the horrific treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, of whom over 3 million died in German custody, mostly from deliberate starvation and exposure. It also justified the brutal anti-partisan warfare, where the collective punishment of civilians became standard practice. For every German soldier killed by resistance fighters, hundreds of innocent villagers could be executed in reprisal. This policy was designed to terrorize the population into submission and accelerate the process of depopulating the land. Ultimately, Hitler's invasion turned the Bloodlands into the central theater for his racial utopia, a project that required unprecedented levels of mass killing. The Holocaust was the most extreme manifestation of this ideology, but it was part of a broader vision of destruction that also targeted Slavs and other groups deemed racially undesirable. The fields of Ukraine were not just a battleground, they were the intended site of a new German racial empire, to be built upon the corpses of the region's native inhabitants. This ideological imperative, to cleanse and colonize, is what made the Nazi occupation of the Bloodlands so uniquely destructive, marking the darkest chapter in this land's tragic history. As the tide of war turned on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army began its momentous push westward, driving the German forces back across the blood-soaked terrain they had conquered. For the surviving inhabitants of the Bloodlands, the retreat of the Wehrmacht should have signaled the end of a long and horrific nightmare. The arrival of Soviet soldiers was for many a moment of genuine liberation from Nazi tyranny. Jewish survivors emerged from hiding, and the immediate threat of racial annihilation receded. However, this liberation was a bitter and deeply compromised one. As the Nazi flag was lowered, the red banner of the Soviet Union was raised in its place, and for millions, one form of occupation was simply replaced by another. The end of the war did not bring peace or freedom, it brought the return of Stalin's terror. The advancing Soviet forces were not just an army of liberation, they were an instrument of political consolidation tasked with re-establishing absolute control over the territories Stalin considered his rightful sphere of influence. The NKVD followed closely behind the frontline troops just as the Einsatzgruppen had followed the Wehrmacht. Their mission was to purge the liberated lands of any elements deemed hostile to Soviet rule. This included anyone who had collaborated with the Germans, but the definition was brutally broad. It quickly expanded to encompass members of non-communist resistance movements, such as the Polish Home Army, who had fought valiantly against the Nazis, but were now seen as obstacles to Stalin's plan for a communist Poland. They were hunted down, arrested, and either executed or deported to the Gulag. One of the most infamous and revealing acts of this period had already occurred in 1940, but was brought to light as the Soviets advanced the Katyn massacre in the forest near Smolensk. The NKVD systematically executed over 22,000 Polish military officers, police officers, and members of the intelligentsia, who had been taken prisoner during the 1939 Soviet invasion of Poland. For years, the Soviets blamed this atrocity on the Nazis. However, the truth was that Stalin had ordered the massacre to eliminate a generation of Polish leaders who would have resisted his post-war plans. This crime cast a long, dark shadow over the so-called liberation, revealing the cold, cynical logic of Soviet policy. The goal was not to restore sovereign nations, but to create subservient satellite states, a process that required the physical elimination of their patriotic elites. For the ordinary people of the Bloodlands, the return of Stalin meant a return to a familiar climate of fear and repression. The cycle of denunciation, arrest, and deportation began anew. The brief, desperate hope for a future free from totalitarian control was extinguished almost as soon as it was kindled. The war against Hitler had been won, but the war for freedom had been lost. The Red Army's victory did not restore the world of 1938, it solidified the divisions of 1939, cementing Soviet domination over the eastern half of the Bloodlands. For those caught in this tragic historical vice, the end of World War II was not an endpoint but merely the beginning of another long chapter of suffering under a different yet equally ruthless master. With the German war machine defeated and Soviet power firmly established, Stalin initiated a final massive wave of social engineering across the newly acquired territories of the Bloodlands. This involved the mass deportation of entire ethnic populations deemed politically unreliable or historically troublesome to the Soviet Empire. The primary targets were the peoples of the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which had been independent nations before the war. Stalin was determined to crush their national aspirations permanently and absorb them fully into the USSR. Beginning in 1945 and continuing into the late 1940s, a series of large-scale deportation operations were launched, designed to break the back of any potential resistance and terrorize the remaining population into submission. The process was brutally efficient and followed a now perfected script. In the middle of the night, NKVD units, often assisted by local collaborators, would surround a village or a city block. Families were given mere minutes to gather a few belongings before being forced from their homes at gunpoint. They were herded onto trucks and taken to railway stations, where they were packed into unheated cattle cars for the long and torturous journey east. These trains, which became symbols of Soviet oppression, traveled for weeks toward the desolate and frozen landscapes of Siberia and Central Asia. Thousands perished during the journey from disease, starvation, or exposure. For those who survived, a new life of forced labor and exile awaited them in the vast network of the Gulag. These deportations were staggering in their scale. In the Baltic states alone, hundreds of thousands of people were uprooted and sent into exile. The operations deliberately targeted the most educated and influential members of society, farmers, teachers, priests, and civil servants, in a clear attempt to decapitate these nations and make them easier to control. Similar deportations were carried out against other groups, including Ukrainians and Poles, who found themselves on the wrong side of newly drawn borders. This was ethnic cleansing on a colossal scale, a final brutal redrawing of the demographic map of the Bloodlands to suit Stalin's imperial ambitions. The goal was to erase historical memory and national identity, replacing it with loyalty to the Soviet state. The return of Stalin and the subsequent campaigns of repression and deportation marked the definitive end of one era of terror and the consolidation of another. The lands that had suffered so intensely under both Hitler and Stalin were now sealed off from the West, locked behind what Winston Churchill would soon call the Iron Curtain. For the people of the Bloodlands, the narrative of World War II as a clear victory for freedom was a cruel fiction. Their experience was one of a double occupation, where the defeat of one tyrant only confirmed the rule of another. The silence that fell over the region was not the silence of peace, but the silence of exhaustion, fear, and a profound collective trauma that would endure for generations. One of the most crucial reasons the history of the Bloodlands matters today, on May 24, 2024, is that it fundamentally challenges our common understanding of mass violence in the 20th century. The 14 million civilians who perished here were not the unfortunate but unavoidable casualties of war. Their deaths were not collateral damage. Instead, Timothy Snyder compellingly argues that these killings were the result of deliberate, calculated, and intentional political strategies. Both Hitler and Stalin viewed mass murder not as a regrettable side effect of their policies, but as an essential instrument for achieving their ideological goals. This perspective forces us to confront a far more disturbing reality. The most horrific atrocities of the era were not accidents but were meticulously planned and executed state projects of annihilation. This understanding shifts the focus from the battlefield to the bureaucracy of death. In the Bloodlands, murder was policy. Stalin's decision to engineer the Holodomor famine was a strategic choice to crush Ukrainian national identity and secure grain for his industrialization program. His Great Terror was a systematic purging of designated enemies based on quotas and categories. Similarly, Hitler's General Plan Ost and the Holocaust were not chaotic rampages but were part of a coherent long-term vision to racially re-engineer Eastern Europe. Recognizing this intentionality is vital because it reveals how modern states can mobilize the full force of their administrative apparatus, police, bureaucrats, planners and soldiers, to commit murder on an unimaginable scale, all under the guise of rational statecraft. By treating these deaths as the consequence of specific policies, the Bloodlands concept restores agency and responsibility to the perpetrators. It moves beyond abstract notions of war or ideology as the cause and instead points directly to the leaders who made the decisions, the officials who drafted the orders, and the individuals who carried them out. This framework prevents us from excusing these horrors as simply the inevitable outcome of a brutal conflict. The killing fields of Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus were not just places where a war happened to be fought. They were the designated destinations for extermination, the very heart of the murderous ambitions of two totalitarian regimes. They were places where the unthinkable became official state business. This distinction is not merely academic, it has profound moral implications. If we see these 14 million deaths as anything less than intentional, we risk diminishing the culpability of the regimes that perpetrated them and misunderstanding the true nature of their evil. The history of the Bloodlands teaches us that the greatest dangers can arise when political leaders possess the power to define entire groups of human beings as obstacles to progress or threats to security. It is a stark reminder that the machinery of a modern state, when guided by a genocidal ideology, can be turned into the most efficient killing machine in history, a lesson of enduring and terrifying relevance. The history of the Bloodlands is not merely a chronicle of past suffering, it serves as a powerful and urgent warning for our contemporary world. It teaches us that stable societies can collapse with terrifying speed when political ideologies dehumanize certain groups of people. The process of turning neighbors into enemies and citizens into targets began with words, propaganda, and the legal codification of exclusion. Both Nazi and Soviet regimes invested heavily in creating a climate where violence against designated enemies became not only acceptable, but necessary. This historical precedent reminds us to remain vigilant against the kind of political rhetoric that seeks to divide society into us and them, as this is often the first step on a path toward atrocity. Furthermore, the story of the Bloodlands underscores the profound danger of statelessness and the vulnerability of populations caught between powerful, aggressive empires. The peoples of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states were targeted with such ferocity precisely because they lacked strong sovereign states capable of protecting them. Their lands were seen as a geopolitical vacuum to be filled, and their lives were considered expendable by expansionist powers. This history highlights the critical importance of international order, respect for national sovereignty, and the institutions designed to prevent such predatory behavior. It is a lesson that resonates deeply in a world where border disputes and spheres of influence continue to fuel conflict and endanger civilian populations. Remembering the specific stories of the victims in the Bloodlands is also a moral duty. For decades, this history was suppressed by Soviet authorities or overshadowed in the West by a focus on the Western Front and the concentration camps in Germany. Giving voice to the victims of the Holodomor, the Great Terror, and the Holocaust by bullets is an act of historical justice. It ensures that these 14 million individuals are not forgotten or reduced to a mere statistic. Their experiences teach us about the human cost of totalitarianism, the fragility of civilization, and the depths of human cruelty and resilience. Their memory challenges us to build a future where such horrors cannot be repeated. Ultimately, the Bloodlands matter because they force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, power, and the modern state. They show us that the capacity for systematic mass murder is not confined to a single evil regime, but can emerge from different ideologies that share a common disregard for human life. The lessons are clear: we must defend democratic institutions, protect minority rights, reject ideologies of hate, and hold leaders accountable for their actions. The soil of Eastern Europe is saturated with the blood of the innocent, and its history is a solemn warning that we ignore at our own peril. It is a past that we must study, remember, and learn from, lest we be condemned to see its shadows rise again. A persistent misconception in popular understanding of 20th century history is the tendency to compartmentalize the crimes of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. We often learn about them as two separate, distinct evils, each confined to its own sphere of influence and its own chapter in the history books. The Holocaust is typically associated with Hitler and Germany, while the Gulag and purges are linked to Stalin and Russia. However, the history of the Bloodlands directly challenges this clean separation. Within this tragic geographical space, the actions of the two regimes were not only concurrent but deeply entangled. Their policies often targeted the same people, their armies occupied the same territories in succession, and at times they even collaborated in their destructive endeavors, creating a complex web of terror that cannot be understood in isolation. The most explicit point of connection was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. This non-aggression treaty was far more than a simple agreement to not attack one another. It contained secret protocols that amounted to a joint conspiracy to destroy and partition the sovereign state of Poland. This pact directly initiated the horrors of World War II in Europe and brought both totalitarian systems into the heart of the Bloodlands simultaneously. For the Polish people, the terror was not a choice between Nazism or communism, but a brutal imposition of both. The Gestapo and the NKVD, while ideological enemies, effectively worked in parallel to eradicate the Polish elite, each regime seeking to eliminate the nation's capacity for future resistance. This period of joint occupation demonstrates that their crimes were not just similar, they were functionally linked. This entanglement continued throughout the war. The Bloodlands became a zone where loyalties were complex and survival often meant navigating between two deadly threats. A person could be persecuted by one regime for reasons that made them a target for the other as well. For example, a Jewish communist in eastern Poland could be arrested by the Soviets as a nationalist deviant and later murdered by the Nazis as a Jew and a communist. The regimes, in their shared obsession with total control, often mirrored each other's methods. The Nazi concentration camp system drew lessons from the Soviet Gulag, and both regimes mastered the art of using bureaucratic language to obscure the reality of mass murder, turning extermination into an administrative task. Timothy Snyder's work compels us to abandon the comforting but inaccurate narrative of two separate histories. He asks us to see the full, horrifying picture of the Bloodlands where these two systems of terror overlapped and interacted. This perspective does not equate the two ideologies, their ultimate goals were different, but it does demand that we recognize their functional similarities and their shared responsibility for the immense suffering in the region. To truly understand what happened, we must see the history of the Bloodlands not as two separate stories, but as one single interwoven tragedy, where the shadows of Hitler and Stalin merged into a singular, suffocating darkness that consumed millions of lives. Another common misconception challenged by the Bloodlands thesis is the idea that victims belonged exclusively to one system of oppression. We tend to categorize individuals as victims of Nazism or victims of Stalinism. The reality for millions was far more complex and tragic. They were victims of both. The concept of double victimhood is central to the history of the Bloodlands. The inhabitants of this region did not experience a single monolithic tyranny. Instead, they endured sequential waves of violence with the perpetrator changing but the suffering remaining constant. This grim cycle of persecution by one regime, followed by persecution from another, is a defining feature of the Bloodlands experience, setting it apart from Western Europe. Consider the fate of the Polish nation. Poland was the first country to be subjected to this dual assault. In 1939, it was carved up between Germany and the Soviet Union. Its citizens in the West faced the terror of Nazi occupation, while those in the East were subjected to Soviet deportations and executions like the Katyn massacre. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the zone of Nazi terror expanded to cover all of Poland. Then, in 1944 and 1945, as the Red Army pushed the Germans back, the survivors of Nazi occupation once again fell under the iron fist of Stalin's regime. For a Pole living through this era, the enemy changed, but the reality of living in a police state did not. This pattern of double victimhood was repeated across the Bloodlands. In Ukraine, peasants who survived Stalin's Holodomor in the 1930s then faced the brutal Nazi occupation which viewed them as subhuman slave labor. Many were worked to death or killed in anti-partisan reprisals. When the Soviets returned, they were subjected to another round of purges and conscription into the Red Army. Similarly, in the Baltic states, the initial Soviet occupation of 1940 was followed by the German invasion of 1941, and then the Soviet reoccupation in 1944, which led to decades of repression and mass deportations. The simple act of surviving one tyrant's reign often made you a target for the next. Understanding this concept of shared tragedy is essential for historical empathy and accuracy. It prevents us from engaging in a sterile competition of victimhood that pits Nazi crimes against Soviet ones. For the people on the ground, such a distinction was meaningless. The threat to their lives was absolute, regardless of whether the executioner wore a German or a Soviet uniform. The history of the Bloodlands is the history of peoples who were systematically destroyed from both sides. It is a chronicle of communities caught in a deadly crossfire, a story of profound and compounded loss that demands to be remembered in its full, devastating complexity. In the final analysis, the journey through the Bloodlands leaves us standing before a chasm of human suffering so vast it defies easy comprehension. The figure of 14 million civilians murdered is not a mere statistic. It represents an ocean of individual lives, each with its own story, its own hopes, and its own brutal end. This essay has traced the overlapping terrors of Hitler and Stalin, from the weaponized hunger of the Holodomor to the intimate brutality of the Holocaust by bullets, from the systematic purges of the Great Terror to the cynical betrayals of the Katyn massacre and the Great Deportations. We have seen how two opposing ideologies in their shared pursuit of utopian transformation converged upon the same lands and peoples with terrifyingly similar methods of annihilation. turning a vibrant part of Europe into the deadliest place on Earth. It is a history that demands not just to be learned, but to be felt. The ultimate lesson of the Bloodlands is one of profound and unsettling warning. It teaches us that the guardrails of civilization are far more fragile than we might wish to believe. When political systems grant themselves the authority to define entire groups of people as less than human, as class enemies, racial inferiors, or obstacles to progress, the path to mass murder becomes alarmingly short. The violence was not born of chaos, but of order. It was bureaucratic, systematic, and intentional. This history compels us, on this day of May 24, 2024, to remain eternally vigilant against the language of dehumanization in our own time, to defend the institutions that protect individual rights, and to recognize that the sovereignty and security of nations are the first line of defense against such predatory empires. To remember the Bloodlands is therefore an act of moral necessity. For decades, the stories of these victims were silenced by the Iron Curtain, their experiences subsumed into competing nationalist narratives, or simply ignored by a world eager to move on. By focusing on the shared geography of their suffering, we give voice to the voiceless and restore a measure of dignity to those who were stripped of everything. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about collaboration, complicity, and the capacity for cruelty that lies within modern societies. This is not easy history, but it is essential, for it contains the keys to understanding the darkest potentials of the modern state, and the profound importance of cherishing human life above all ideological abstractions. Let us not forget them. Let us not forget the Ukrainian peasant starving in his own home, the Polish officer kneeling before an execution pit, the Jewish child shot in a ravine, or the Baltic family herded onto a cattle car bound for Siberia. Their stories are buried beneath the soil of Eastern Europe, but their echoes resonate as a solemn charge to future generations. We have a duty to listen to these echoes, to learn from this past, and to ensure that no land is ever again forced to bear the name of Bloodlands. The burden of this history is heavy, but it is one we must carry to honor the dead and to protect the living, ensuring that humanity never repeats its most catastrophic failures.